Olá, TUTAMÉIA está ao vivo. E antes de mais nada, nós reafirmamos nosso apoio e solidariedade à campanha internacional pela libertação do jornalista Julian Assange, preso político do imperialismo. Estamos nós aqui nos nossos estúdios domésticos, a Eleonora.
O Rodolfo.
E do outro lado da tela, direto de Nova York, fala conosco a economista Clara Mattei. Seja bem-vindo, Clara. Eu passo de imediato a palavra para a Eleonora para fazer uma apresentação da Clara como manda o figurino e iniciar, então, essa nossa entrevista deste fim de tarde, início de noite. Eleonora.
Clara Mattei, welcome to TUTAMÉIA. Clara Mattei é graduada em Filosofia, doutora em Economia, atualmente leciona no Departamento de Economia da New School of Social Research em Nova York. Suas pesquisas se concentram em emergência das ideias econômicas do século XX e seus impactos na construção de políticas públicas. Hoje é dia 30 de novembro de 2023 e a Clara está lançando em português, no Brasil, pela Boitempo, seu livro que é um sucesso, né? A Ordem do Capital, como economistas inventaram austeridade e abriram caminho para o fascismo. Nós vamos fazer as perguntas em inglês, essa entrevista vai ser feita em inglês.
Deixa eu só lembrar que vai ser possível, não imediatamente, mas daqui a alguns dias, você ter as legendas automáticas, em inglês, obviamente, as legendas automáticas do YouTube. Isso não é imediato, demora um tempo, mas também ajuda, eventualmente, na compreensão.
Clara, welcome again. Your book established the relationship between austerity and fascism. Especially in the early 20s, in the 20th centuries. Does this relationship remain in the same way in this 21st century? What explains this relationship between fascism and neoliberalism, austerity?
Yes. Thank you. The book, The Capital Order, tries to show how austerity is a fundamental element of our capitalist economy. And when I say austerity, what I mean is a set of policies that the state, that governments apply, starting from cuts in social expenditures. So cutting healthcare, schools, transport, public housing, and instead the state spending on subsidizing private investors, the state spending in war, the state spending in bailing out banks. So the state spending resources for the few, the elite, the capitalist, and spending away from people. Impoverishing people by making them more dependent on the market for survival, meaning that in order for us to survive, we have to have money in our pockets. And this money comes from the fact that we are forced to go work for a low wage. This is one element of austerity, cutting in fiscal, in social spending. The other element is regressive taxation, meaning cutting taxes on the rich, cutting corporate taxes, cutting inheritance taxes, cutting taxes on wealth, while consumption taxes go up for the majority of us. So the people have to pay more taxes than the wealthy. This is fiscal austerity. Fiscal austerity goes together with monetary austerity, which is increases in interest rates. Interest rates go up, and this makes it more difficult for workers, not just because it is more difficult to borrow money, if we need to borrow money, it is also that we lose our jobs. Interest rate going up is not something neutral. It actually hits us hard because there are less job offers, there are layoffs, and there's more unemployment, and this makes workers more vulnerable. And finally, we have industrial austerity, which is about privatizing, the state deciding to sell off all the industries and business to the private sector, and the state decides to deregulate labor, so attacks on unions, trying to make labor more and more precarious. This is austerity. It operates as a trinity, I tried to show: fiscal, monetary, industrial. They make sense together because they systematically make the people, workers, more vulnerable. They silence our capacity to imagine an alternative society based on production for use instead of production for need. And at the same time, this helps the accumulation at the top. It helps the wealthy get even more wealthy. Okay. And this is, again, something the state actively does. It is government that actively implement austerity. So what I try to show in the book is that austerity is something that capitalism requires, because capitalism requires us to be forced, compelled to go work for a low wage. This is the foundation of a capitalist economy. The title, The Capital Order, how do you say it in Portuguese? The title of the book?
A Ordem do Capital.
Exactly. This means that capital as money, capital as GDP growth, requires the order, the political order of having the majority subordinated to exploitation. And when I use the word exploitation, I use it in a technical sense, used by economists of the tradition that is critical, which means that we as workers produce greater value than the value we put in our pockets when we get paid at the end of the month. This is the source of how capitalism works, and the capitalist economic growth is based on our exploitation. So, sorry, I needed to say this because I needed to explain what austerity is. Austerity is a term that we hear a lot, but a lot of times we don't understand what it is because the media doesn't tell us what austerity is. And when they tell us something about austerity, it seems like it's a technical necessity. It's what economists do, and we cannot complain. Now, what I try to show is that if you look at history, you find out that austerity is a powerful weapon that serves to maintain a system that is a system that produces very few winners, that is good for the people at the top, but also produces many, many losers, which is the majority of us. Now, we're just saying how austerity is structural to capitalism. It is not a bug, it's a feature. Now, how does fascism fit, to answer your question? This is where history is helpful as well. We are used to thinking that fascism is not capitalism. For some reason, the way they teach us history, at least in Europe, is it seems like fascism is something else. Really, if we want to be precise and we want to take history seriously, we discover that Benito Mussolini, the founding father of fascism, who came to power in Italy in 1922, was put into power by the liberal elite, who was very worried about protecting the capital order. So we see how fascism was instrumental in a moment in which capitalism was being challenged. After the First World War, workers were mobilizing to organize a different society. There were many experiments that I talk about at length in my book, in which you see that not just in Eastern Europe, also in the West, at the center of capitalism, workers were mobilizing to organize production democratically. They were organizing councils. They were putting together ways of thinking about a society that could be for the people and not against the people. A society that was about producing for use, not for profit. That was about abolishing the capital order, abolishing wage relations. Okay? In this moment that I explain with a lot of archives and in deep depth in the first part of the book, in this moment, the elite organized very, very forcefully to make sure capitalism was protected. And this is when Benito Mussolini, the father of fascism, played a very crucial role in Italy, a country where workers had occupied the factories. Peasants were organizing agriculture independently from the landlords. It is in this moment that fascism came and implemented austerity. So Benito Mussolini was very, very good at doing the whole set of the Trinity that I just described to you. He laid off public employees. He did the biggest privatization campaign in the history of Western capitalism. He at the time he cut social expenditure. He increased interest rates to go back to the gold. And especially what he did was outlaw unions, abolish the right to strike, and also, most importantly, repressed wages by law. So in all of this, you see the strikes stopped and the state finances became better. So everyone was enthusiastic of Mussolini. So the liberal economists in Italy, but also in Britain and the United States, if you read the Economist, the Times, all of the major bourgeois newspapers, they were applauding Mussolini and thus strengthening Mussolini's power. So I would say to your question, this is the main connection we see historically, is that the fascist regime was possible because of the support of the intelligentsia, the elite, and this was because Mussolini was very good at subordinating workers, at reestablishing the economic compulsion that forces us to go work for a low wage, in precarious conditions. So this is the connection historically. And I think today we see that governments that are authoritarian and fascist leaning also are very good at implementing austerity. Now, this is the case, for example, in Italy, again, where I come from. Giorgia Meloni now explicitly makes reference to Mussolini, and she came to power and is doing very, very harsh austerity. She is cutting all social expenditures, and this is making her look very good in the eyes of the United States, of the markets, right? Our rating in the market is very high as Italian, while Italians are getting poorer and inequality is getting larger. And I think you see this, of course, you've seen this in Brazil as well, the fact that authoritarian governments are those who best implement austerity. Now, it is the case that today, the electoral success of right-wing governments also comes as the result of the success of austerity that has been wielded for almost a century in our societies, so that people have lost class consciousness. People have lost the sense that they can imagine a world that is better and construct a future that is radically away from capitalism, and instead feel vulnerable, want to blame people that are poorer than them. And this is the reason why these right-wing governments have appeal. They seem to represent an alternative, but the reality, as history tells us, is that fascism is capitalism, and is capitalism on steroids, because fascism is very good at implementing austerity.
So what austerity brings to society? People say, I mean, the rich people, landlords, say that austerity gives society a healthy or healthier economy.
Yes.
Is it true? What does it bring to the people, to the workers?
So this is important, and this is why we should not talk about an economy in general, but of a capitalist economy. And this is not something that we hear a lot about, because they want to trick us in thinking that we are in the only economy possible. So what you see is that austerity oftentimes may be good for a capitalist economy in the sense that it may help, for example, promote private investment, because we know that private capital is attracted to places where workers are very weak, where there's very little strikes, where they can keep the cost of labor down, and where they pay very little taxes, right? So austerity is meant, especially in the south of the globe, to attract private capital, which is ultimately the way growth happens under capitalism. So we see that the paradox is that austerity really reveals how the capitalist economy functioning well does not equate to an economy that functions well for the people. So this is what is very revealing, is that a healthy economy does not mean that people are healthy. Actually, often when the economy is healthy in the sense that our budget is in order and we are very competitive, this equates to a society that often has impoverished the majority of the workers. So I think this is very, very important to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind is that, unfortunately, we cannot reduce austerity to a policy mistake. This has been done by many Keynesian economists who just say, well, austerity is just irrational, it's bad theory, it's bad policy. Unfortunately, we cannot explain why it is so crucial in a capitalist society, why austerity is always present, why states from the left and from the right, while governments from all different parties end up implementing austerity. And this is, to explain this, we need to understand that austerity is actually very functional, again, to preserving us in a situation by which we cannot imagine a different future for humans, in giving us a sense that capitalism is eternal and it is the only economic system possible. So this is what we need to understand, is that actually austerity reveals why our economic system is fundamentally unjust, fundamentally exploitative, and thus we need to have another alternative. It also reveals how economists who tell us that austerity is a technical necessity are fighting the worst class warfare. They participate in one-sided class warfare against the people. Economists are not neutral experts. They are experts that serve the purpose of preserving a society that is hierarchical and that goes against the interest of the majority.
As you said in the book, you show that austerity emerged in the situation that the workers are very demanding after the World War, the First World War, and you have a social movement very strong. And nowadays you don't have this. We don't have a big social movement. We don't have, the unions are weak. Why can we explain the emergence of fashion nowadays if there is no social movements? And you said just little things about how the workers vote for some for the ones that will act against their own interest. What explain the emergence of fashions in the situation that we don't have this confrontation as we had in the beginning of the 20th century?
Thank you. So again, I think we can explain this by looking at how austerity is very successful in achieving what is supposed to achieve, meaning in achieving the weakening and the disciplining of workers. When economists increase interest rates, when the central banks of the world increase interest rates and increase unemployment, this makes us more vulnerable and makes us lose the sense that we are workers and we are collectively powerful and we can go against those who profit from us being exploited. What happens is that we actually start fighting against each other and hating those who are worse than us, right? Worst off, meaning, right? Worst off than us. This is part of how austerity is very successful in preserving the capital order, right? By, again, tying the hands of people and foreclosing the imagination, killing the imagination for a different future. And I think this is why, indeed, people vote for the right wing, hoping in a change, because people do suffer. But they, what we should do, I think, as scholars, is help people realize that their suffering will not be solved by fascist-leaning governments, because fascism is bound to be about austerity, because austerity is about the state explicitly fostering capital accumulation and the enrichment of the few. So there needs to be a greater awareness of the fact that if we're suffering, the solution is not fascism, because fascism will do exactly what the other governments before fascism has done, right? That's the thing. I want to show how it's not just fascism that is the problem. Austerity is a problem, and austerity is being actually implemented historically by liberal democracies. Britain, the United States, Brazil, right? Austerity is unfortunately, is much more structural than just right-wing governments. So this is the first thing I would like to say. The second thing, to answer your question, is the following. Do not be tricked into the narrative of the economists that tell you that workers are weak and will always be weak. The reality is that even if workers are weaker than they were after 1919, the years I look at 1919, so 100 years ago, when there was a lot of revolutionary fervor, we might be weaker than then, but the whole point, and why this book is ultimately, I think, a book that is about struggle but is optimistic, it tells you the capital order is fragile. Even if we are weak, the system is based on the subordination of the majority, so this is never to be taken for granted. There is always mobilization, there's always alternatives, there's always a lot happening, and this is why the governments are so focused on austerity, to make sure that these movements do not become successful. But I think the point of optimism is to say we shouldn't think that it is the end of history and that workers are weak forever. Actually, what we see, for example, today in the United States is a moment in which workers are again strong. And the United States is a country that has implemented structural austerity for at least the last 50 years. Okay, I live in New York City in the realm of austerity. You turn on the radio, there's our mayor who's cutting libraries, cutting health care. We live in the worst austerity state, yet workers can still mobilize, right? So what I would like to say is that austerity is a powerful tool that the elite use to protect the capital order, but this capital order is never to be taken for granted. Thus, the need to constantly be pushing for austerity if you are at the top, right? So I think this is this message of optimism. We shouldn't think that the system is taken for granted, because the experts that run our economy know very well that if they give people benefits, these people might ask for greater benefits and the system gets into trouble. This is what happened in the United States. With the COVID, the government had to give a bit of money to people because other people were dying. And the result was that people realized that perhaps they could stop living as exploited workers, and they resigned. The Great Resignation is real. More than 50 million Americans just in 2022 left their jobs willingly. Plus, now there's many strikes. Workers are winning a lot of battles. The automobile workers just won an enormous battle. So this is the thing. Class struggle is never over. And that's how we have to explain austerity. Austerity is a powerful weapon of the class struggle to favor the elite. And this we need to understand and stop believing that austerity is a technical necessity and that economists do the interest of everyone, because they do not.
I'd like you to comment on the role of governments, of the state in austerity. During the pandemic years, we had a growing presence of the state in the economy, putting more money into the health, even governments that were liberal. So this what's the meaning of this? This could mean that people get more aware that the state is needed for the growth of the economy or the welfare of people.
Okay, so here is where I think it's very important to maintain the lens of class analysis that I really try to develop in my work. We need to understand again that the state, unfortunately, is a capitalist state. Okay, the states that run the economies, both globally and at the national level, are capitalist states, meaning that they're states that emerged with the emergence of our capitalist market economy, and these states depend on the capital accumulation that happens at the level of the private investment, right? So we are in a situation by which capitalist states have a role to play, which is that of stabilizing the economy. And we know that stabilizing the economy often means actually punishing workers, right? So we shouldn't have a naive understanding of the state wanting to do the good for us, because actually under capitalism, the state is alienated from the people and is playing a specific role. Now, what happens is that political mobilization can push states, can push governments to do greater social redistribution. But this comes if there is pressure from below. If there's actual mobilization of people trying to pressure the state through elections, through demonstration, through unions, to actually do some redistributive measures. Yes? Now, what happens is that if you redistribute, under capitalism, there are very clear political limits to social redistribution. So again, what I would like to show in my work is that there's never only economic problems. Economic problems are always political problems, okay? This is why we are meant to think, because of how economic theory has taught us that there's economics and then there's politics and there's separate realms. The reality is that all the economic issues are deeply political issues. So what it means is that if you, for example, is that if you give people some benefits, then what happens is that this might trigger in people the understanding that actually our economy is political, that there is space perhaps to think of different priorities, to not prioritize the private sector, but prioritize, for example, the needs of people. And this may trigger mobilization, may trigger social redistribution, may trigger protest, and may trigger even that people do not want to accept being workers, wage workers anymore. So we see here that it's a very thin balance that a capitalist state can do if it wants to actually socially redistribute. Because ultimately, the reality is that social distribution may open imagination of people in imagining a different economic system. And this is dangerous for capitalism, right? And this is exactly what happened after the First World War. The welfare state was born. The state had intervened in the economy to win the war like never before. And this is what I talk about in the book. The state had taken a very important role in the economy, and this had the outcome of politicizing the economic sphere, meaning that people realized that they could change economic institutions because economic institutions were the outcome of political choice. Okay, so this is when it is a thin balance, because if the capitalist state does too much for the people, then people may want to participate more in the economy and may want to realize that the economy does not work for them and may want to change things more democratically. And this democratic demands of participation in the economy is what economists are very scared about. Yes. So the economists advising the government, for example, really want independent central banks, right? This is an example. Independent central bank is something that has been constructed historically to keep people out of economic decisions. This is very important. This is what I show in my book, is that you can go fascist like Benito Mussolini, but you can also implement austerity in other non-fascist settings by insulating economic decision from people, by excluding people from participation in monetary decisions, for example, by creating independent central banks. And actually, the central banks in Brazil and the independent central banks in Brazil was actually exported by the protagonists of my book, who were working in Britain and the British Treasury. They were going around the world, including in Brazil at the end of the 1920s, to tell these governments that they had to implement independent central banks if they wanted to do prudent finances. Okay, so it's very important to understand that ultimately, this is what the capitalist state does. It makes sure that people cannot participate in economic decisions that really matter, because if they did, then things might go differently and might not be coherent with the logic of austerity and the logic of capitalism, which is a logic that goes, again, against the majority and in favor of the minority.
How is the whole of the privatization in this austerity plan? What's the importance of privatizations?
Yes, privatization is a very, very important element of the austerity policies, because they, what happens, as mainstream economists tell us, and they know, and this is why they want to do it, if you lay off public employees and workers have to go compete in the private sector, they are subjected to the competition of the impersonal market forces and will have to accept lower wages. So public employees are directly facing the capitalist state, and thus are indeed directly politically involved in trying to bargain for their rights. And this is potentially dangerous, because workers may get too many rights for our system. If you privatize, what happens is that you make workers more vulnerable, because they are then having to compete by accepting worse conditions with other workers. So this is the first thing, is that privatization helps weaken the workers. But privatization, of course, also helps boost the profits of the private capitalists, who ultimately are the ones running the show in a capitalist economy, in the sense that, again, the capitalist state is meant to protect, to foster private investment, because this is how our economy today is organized. But this type of economy, again, is very irrational, because it does not serve the interest of the people who make this economy work, namely the workers, whose work is the root of our value. And if I can add to this, I want to stress that a very important message of the book is to look at economic theory. The book looks at economic theory. It looks at the origin of the mainstream economics that now we take for granted. That is the economics that experts at the IMF, at the International Monetary Fund, at the World Bank, at the various treasuries in Brazil, in the United States, in Italy, these economists are taught to think according to a very specific type of theory. Okay, so this is very important, is that there's no one economics, right? There's no one economic discipline. Just as there is no one economic system, and we're in a capitalist system, there's no one economic discipline. There's different theories, and we happen to be ruled by the dominant theory, which is the theory that justifies privatizations, that justifies austerity, and tells us that this is the right way to do it, because indeed what matters is to incentivize, according to the models, those who are the virtuous entrepreneurs. right? So these models tell us that actually workers are worth very little. Who matter are the entrepreneurs, and it's the entrepreneurs who we should think for the running of the economy. So it is very important to see that now we are used to this, but in the early 1920s, another framework was circulating, a framework that believed in the labor theory of value, that put the workers at the center, that understood classes and conflict. Now we are in a theory that prioritizes harmony, individuals, and puts the entrepreneur instead of the worker, and thus tells us that, of course, the state should incentivize the entrepreneurs by doing austerity. So it is very important to keep in mind that economics is not a neutral discipline. What we study as economics is something that comes specifically out of a historical moment in which the objective was to weaken the people in favor of the capital order.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about the interest rates. In Brazil, the independent central bank keeps one of the highest real interest rates in the world. And they tell us that the interest rate is just like a technical tool to keep the economy on balance. So you tell us that the interest rates are part of a political project. How's that so?
Yes, thank you. This is a very good example of how economics, economic theory is not a neutral theory, but is very political. So they tell us that in the way to defeat inflation, the only way to defeat inflation is to increase the interest rates. Now, to justify this, you do it by telling us that the reason why inflation is high is because ultimately we are in a moment in which wages are increasing and demand of people is too high. The consumption demand is too high. So the solution for economists is to increase interest rates to induce a slowdown in the economy, and especially to operate on the labor market and make this labor market less what's the word? Oh my God, I can't find the word. Less good for workers, okay? Labor market that is actually worse for workers. How? By increasing unemployment. Again, so when you increase interest rates, what happens is that the economy starts slowing down. Why? Because it is more expensive to borrow, right? When you increase interest rate, what you're doing is increasing the price of borrowing money, right? It costs more to borrow money. You're increasing the cost of borrowing money. So this means that it is very good for those who have capital to lend. This is why it's very good right now in Brazil. If you are wealthy, you can invest in state bonds and get a lot of interest from the money you're investing. Yes? At the same time, what happens is that you start seeing less job openings and potentially layoffs. And ultimately, interest rates going up are going to cause a worse labor market, a labor market that is less tight, as economists tell us. When the labor market has more unemployment, this means that the workers lose bargaining power. Yes? When unemployment is high, workers have less strength to demand higher wages, to mobilize, and to get something from their employers. So when interest rates go up, this is not just a monetary issue. It immediately hits, or almost immediately hits, the labor market. And this is not something that, again, economists don't know. They know, and this is why they are increasing interest rates, because they do want to weaken the bargaining power of the workers. This all started in the United States when workers were indeed stronger, right? experts were very preoccupied by the numbers they were reading because they were seeing nominal wages going up, especially in the service sector, which historically only operates if you keep wages low, right? While in the manufacturing sector, you can also increase productivity to maintain high rates of profit. In the service sector, restaurants, hotels, all of the what ultimately the United States are mostly about right now, right? The service, retail, all of this, right? For example, Amazon, Starbucks, these companies make profits only if wages are kept low. This is the way you maintain high profit rates in the service sector. So there was a need to avoid wages from going up. There was a need to avoid people not going back to work. So if you actually slow down the economy, you create a recession, and this makes people, again, subordinated by the economic compulsion of having to go and accept a low wage if they want to survive. Okay, so this is very important. Again, we see that interest rate going up preserves the capital order, and this is not neutral, right? And it's interesting because they're doing this in a moment in which a lot of other economists, not those who rule, but other economists tell us that the reason why there is inflation is actually due to higher profit margins. So they have nothing to do actually with workers, pushing up, increasing demand. And moreover, the reality is that inflation, and this is something that, again, no one tells us ever, is not an automatic mechanism. There is inflation because capitalists, those who produce, right? We have given up production as a conscious political process, and production happens through the private investors. These private investors decide the prices they want to put on commodities, and they can decide to dump the costs on the consumers. Okay, this is not automatic. It is a political decision again. Okay, so instead of thinking of solving inflation, for example, by controlling the profit margins of the producers, controlling the profit margins of the large corporations that produce food and commodities around the world, instead of, for example, putting some price caps, right? Political price caps on goods, especially primary goods. This is not what economic experts are doing. They are increasing interest rates. So again, we see that there are a variety of choices to solve inflation, but the one that is picked by those who run the central banks, including in Brazil, is the solution that once more makes the workers suffer. And this is, again, not a mistake. It is done to make sure that people are stuck in a condition of vulnerability, of weakness. And this is what capitalism needs in order to not shake, to not falter, and to not risk being substituted by a society that is run differently, especially in a moment in which people are realizing that there's an ecological crisis, there's an equality crisis, the system is not working to fulfill our basic needs. This is the moment in which austerity is more than ever useful for the elite to preserve their power and have us think that this is the only way to actually manage the economy. It is not the only way. This is a very political, a very repressive way of organizing our economy, and people need to know this, awaken, and mobilize for a different future.
Clara, in your book, you remember that Lula promised to put the poor in the budget. However, you wrote that until now, continuity prevails in relation to Temer and Bolsonaro. Why you said that, and what would be the reasons that prevent Lula from putting an end to austerity, or at least face austerity in another way?
Yes, this is what is very sad, is that in many countries, not just in Brazil, austerity is often wielded by those who supposedly represent the people. In Italy in 1970, in the 1970s, another moment in which workers had a lot of power and were demanding a different society, it was actually the head of the Communist Party in Italy, Enrico Berlinguer, who famously started enacting austerity very harshly. So I think it is very important to keep Lula, like all other governments, accountable. And this can only happen if indeed there is pressure from the people to push the Lula government to maintain the promises of actually socially redistributing. Because as we know, this is a political choice with a lot of consequences on the economy, right? Because indeed, the Lula government, like all other governments around the globe, feel a lot of pressure to implement austerity, right? Because austerity is the way that the markets want us to operate. So there's a lot of pressure because there can be capital flights, right? Brazil can lose a lot of capital because private capitalists decide to go invest somewhere else. If they're being taxed too much, if social expenditures are too high and they feel like workers are demanding too much. So we see here that also those in power are bounded by the compulsion of the capitalist economy, right? Again, the capitalist economy to run smoothly according to its logic requires a high dosage of austerity to benefit private enterprise and to weaken workers. So this is the thing. The pressure is very high, coming from the global economy, from the IMF. What all these states should continue doing is austerity. So if we want a real change of direction, then this is not going to happen spontaneously. It will only happen if people really, really understand that they want something different. And at that point, it becomes a political battle in the sense that if Brazil does not implement austerity, it will get potentially punished by other market actors around the globe. But at that point, it is about priorities. And this is why economic decisions are political decisions. And it's a matter of the Brazilian government wanting to do something that is actually for the people, or wanting to, as always, go please the international and national private investors and the wealthy. So it is a political struggle. And this is what we need to know in order to be able to fight it at our advantage as much as possible.
So what you are saying is that Lula doesn't have the strength to implement the political measures or the social political measures that he defended during his campaign, or.
So I am no expert in Brazilian political politics, unfortunately. And indeed, the preface that you are referring to, it was written with Mariella, who is actually from Brazil and knows much more. So we wrote that together, and she provided the majority of information. I'm not saying that Lula necessarily does not have the strength to do it. What I'm saying is that it won't happen automatically, in the sense that as any leader of a capitalist state, the pressures for austerity are very, very high. So if the Lula government wants to go against austerity, which I really, really hope he will do, he will need to put a lot of effort. And this will come also if people are maintain their mobilization to push Lula to continue in his promises. We see what happened with Biden. Biden came to government promising a great future for American workers. Guess what? He did absolutely nothing of what he promised. Okay. So Biden is a very good example of how Republicans and Democrats alike, they always tend to do austerity, right? What Biden is doing is spending a lot of money, but not for the people. The American state is spending money on the war, putting a lot of money in the pockets of the profit of the military industrial complex. Okay. Biden is putting a lot of money in incentivizing private asset managers, Blackstone, all of the really, really, really big capitalist groups in investing in, for example, green infrastructure. It's not the state investing directly. The state is subsidizing the private sector. Biden has not done any of the social redistribution, including cutting, for example, the student loan that he promised. Okay, he's witnessing and seeing interest rate hikes and approving of the central bank of the Fed. Okay, so what I'm saying is that the problem is that there needs to be a lot, also in the United States, a lot more pressure on the democratic government to see the government actually deliver on the promises, because otherwise the priorities remain those of the capital order, because guess what? The powerful people with the money are directly in contact with Biden, are the ones who have paid for the Biden campaign, and are there to tell him that the only way is to do austerity. So this is what I'm just saying, is that it's not enough to just vote for a president that promises to not do austerity. It's very important to keep these governments accountable, to hold them accountable by not giving up rising consciousness and having people actually participate in demanding for a different future. What is sad to see in the United States is that with Biden in power, the left disappeared. While during Trump, there was a lot of mobilization, it's gone. So you see how, in a way, we cannot just remain stuck to the limits of electoral politics. We need to do much more if we want to change of direction.
And why so? Why the left disappears? In a sense, this also happens here in Brazil.
Yes, this is why I think it's important to continue the conversation that we're having. And I hope people will read my book, because ultimately, we need to have our eyes open that, unfortunately, again, capitalist states run via a democracy that is a facade. We are not in a society that is about economic democracy. It's a society in which there is a pretense of democracy that happens once every 4 years when we go and vote. And that's it. That's our participation. That is not sufficient to prevent austerity from happening. And so I think the problem is that a lot of the left is overly optimistic about electoral results. It is not enough to have a president that says he will do what the people want for this to happen. And I think what happens is that in moments in which the Democrats win in the United States, then in a way the left, sits down. There's a sense of relaxation, okay, we made it, we voted at the election, we won, now we can just watch. I'm sorry, if you just watch, once you've won the election, you are going to lose in the policies, because there's no way that these governments will not go for the austerity route, if not, again, with some real serious mobilization from below.
Clara, we are seeing a huge change in geopolitical order, the rise of China, this group, this alliance between Brazil, Russia, India, South Africa, Iran. We are seeing different movements that are not exactly in the austerity policy. China is not austerity policy. What is the impact of these geopolitical changes in this idea of austerity? Is this idea losing ground in the world?
I think to see that, we need to actually pay attention to the people more than the governments. I have my colleague Ying Chen, who is from China and studies China. And if you look at carefully at what the Chinese government is also doing, unfortunately, is very much about austerity. There has been a constant privatization, an effort to keep wages very low, a deregulation, especially in the areas in the South where production is happening. There's lots of deregulation and tax cuts for the private entrepreneurs. So unfortunately, we could say that austerity is much more widespread than what one thinks at the surface. I was just in Sweden, where they translated my book And is Sweden, one thinks, oh, the country of social democracy. Guess what? Sweden has been suffering from very, very high levels of austerity in the form of privatization and subsidizing the private sector in school, health, and people getting impoverished since the 90s. So even in the countries that we less expect austerity is there. So it is very important to go beyond the surface and what is being announced by the governments, and actually figure out that people are often in many countries having to battle against austerity. So I think the reality here is that it's not just enough for other countries that are not the United States to make a comeback, and I'm all for that. The United States is a declining empire and is only doing things that are horrendous for people. It is enough to see what is happening now in Gaza and how supportive Biden has been of this utter slaughter and killing of children. And it's just levels of this level of cruelty are beyond comprehension. And I think, though, people are seeing all of this and are mobilizing. So this is what I think. I think it is really, rather than the states, it's the people that need to be mobilized. And I'm very optimistic, because I think that the climate catastrophe, the wars, the suffering, the impoverishment are things that are getting people to be much more sensitive.
You talk about mobilization. We've seen in the United States the past 30 days lot more marches and mobilization of people than in the past decade, I'd say, and with a political motivation, support for the Palestine. Do you believe this can have some impact in the political arena and in the economic arena inside the States?
Yes, absolutely. I think that any mobilization is good mobilization, because it increases the awareness of people. It gets people to claim back spaces for community building, for dialogue that is political dialogue. These are the spaces that austerity and the capitalist states take away from us. So reclaiming these spaces are fundamental. And I think more than ever, what is happening now in Gaza is really showing the horrendous face of our capitalist global order. And it is a moment, I think, that will radicalize people in directions that are more imaginative, especially for the younger generation. So I'm very hopeful. And this was, my small contribution is to try to develop historical studies that reveal what capitalism has been about in the last century. And this, I think, is all part of how I can give a small contribution to a battle that has to happen directly by the people, for the people, and we need to keep battling in this direction.
Great. Clara, would like to thank you very much for this interview. Lembrando, agora I'll talk a little in Portuguese. Lembrando que a economista Clara Mattei está lançando aqui no Brasil, ou está sendo lançada aqui no Brasil, a tradução de seu livro apresentado no ano passado, e que vem tendo muito sucesso no mundo, é A Ordem do Capital: Como Economistas Inventaram a Austeridade e Abriram Caminho para o Fascismo. É o livro que está sendo lançado pela Boitempo aqui no Brasil. A gente agradece a participação da Clara aqui nessa entrevista, agradecemos a participação de todos vocês que nos acompanharam durante essa conversa. Lembramos que essa entrevista fica disponível em todos os canais TUTAMÉIA, é só buscar por TUTAMÉIA TV, e você nos encontra nas várias plataformas de podcast, no Twitter, no Facebook, no YouTube. No YouTube, não deixe de se inscrever no nosso canal, clicar na sinetinha para receber avisos de novos vídeos. E agora a gente vai pedir a palavra aqui de fechamento da Clara para essa entrevista. Clara, thank you. We'd like you to have the final words. here in this interview. This time with no questions. The word's yours.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure to talk with you. I do strongly believe that knowledge is power. This is why we need critical knowledge, but knowledge cannot be enough. We need to participate in changing the world. The good news is that if you study the history of capitalism, you find out that it is not an eternal and immovable system. It is something that has to be actively preserved by the elite via austerity. And this is why this means that there is a lot of space for counteraction and for actually building a future that is much more humane. And I do think that your television is so important because it is through informing, through dialogue, through building community that we start opening our eyes and feeling the strength to play very hard battles, because they're not easy battles, but we need to know our enemy. And this is what I tried to do in my book. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you
so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
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 Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
You too.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Tchau, pessoal.
Tchau.